The Atheist Debates Patreon Project presents Religion and the Mind, Part 2. So in a recent video, I talked about religion and the mind, although to be honest, the video wasn't so much about the mind as much as it was about epistemology. It was a look at the fact that a normative, typical, even optimal human mind without any other impediments was stuck in a reality where absolute certainty is impossible, where the reliability of the senses is something that is at least questionable. And so a God seeking to have humans rationally conclude that this God exists and what this God wants is inhibited by even an optimal mind. And today I want to expand that further, because I really think that any reasonable look at this scenario could lead only to the conclusion that the types of gods we're talking about, the types of gods that are creators who put us in a world expecting us to reach a rational conclusion that they exist and reach rational conclusions about what it is that they want or expect, etc., is absolutely defeated by the facts of this universe when it comes to what's wrong with our brains. So let's imagine there's a track coach at a local high school, and he's got 10 members on his track team, and he knows that the fastest of these can do one complete lap in about a minute. If he brings everybody out to the track and essentially sets up a note or a sign that says, when the starting pistol goes off, each of you should start running, and everyone who completes the track in 1 minute or less, I'm going to take you out for ice cream. And everybody who doesn't complete the track in a minute or less, you're off the track team. Now, that already seems a little problematic, even knowing that the best runners on the team would have a difficult time doing the track in a minute or less. But it's not outside the realm of possibility. But then this track coach decides to make some of the members of the track team deaf, so they can't hear the starting pistol. Makes a few of them blind, so that they can't see where they're going, no matter how fast they could run. Cuts off the leg of a couple of track members, puts some obstacles in the path, and essentially makes it so that nobody could possibly achieve the thing that he's achieving, or he's expecting them to achieve. We would look at that as a preposterous scenario. And if we were to also say that this track coach was a good track coach who knew how to coach people properly and was out to create the best team that he could, we really recognize this is just absurd. This does not make any sense. And yet we live in a world where, presumably, according to a number of different religious models, there's a God who wants us all to rationally conclude that he exists. And as we spoke last time about how even an optimally functioning human mind has limitations and obstacles in the way that would prevent it from reaching certain conclusions, in addition to this, there are human minds that aren't functioning optimally. And I don't just mean that there are variances in people's intelligence level or their understanding of something or their education of something that is all beyond these people's control, but we have incredibly strong mental illnesses that affect people's perceptions of reality. People suffer from strong delusions. There are disorders, schizophrenia, sociopathy, that impact one's ability to interact with reality in a reasonable, rational sense. Never mind the fact that we're already not perfect and we're prone to reaching conclusions without enough evidence or flying off the handle. How could it possibly make sense to have schizophrenia in a world like this, or delusions in a world like this, or mental deficiencies related to cognition in a world like this? I had a relative who was essentially born with virtually no brain function. I don't know the exact condition, but without any clarity on this, he essentially lived for a few years and stayed in a bassinet. Now, nobody thinks that even if he was able to respond to touch or sounds or recognize them as there, that there wasn't cognition there. There wasn't an ability to understand concepts at all. In the early years of dealing with mental health issues, the churches, religions, basically wrote it off as demonic possession, or you were given over to spirits or possessed by demons. There was something that was happening to you, and God was the one that could sort it out, and religion was the thing that could save you. This view of our minds, as archaic and horrifying as it seems today, may have been the best thing that they could come up with at the time. But their claims that these things were tied to demons and spirits, not only did it build and support a stigmatization with regard to mental health issues that persists to this very day, but it prohibited us and slowed our progress towards investigating and understanding the human mind so that we could begin to discover which things we could treat and how. Religion's done a huge disservice to people in a lot of different areas, and I'm not picking a particular religion. Some of them are better in some areas than others. But the human mind is this mysterious thing, and how we view and think about our mind is there a ghost in the machine? Is my brain producing my mind? Is my mind the thing that is me? If I chop off my little finger, I don't cease to be me. If I chop off my hand, I don't cease to be me. It's perhaps why in the Highlander series, the famous, when your head leaves your neck, it's over. That was the one way to kill. And maybe in modern medicine, the notion of brain death, when brain function ceases, is often used as one measure of death. In the modern world, death is viewed as a process more than it is a destination. And things that would have resulted in someone staying dead 100 years ago are now things that we can revive people from. If you have a heart attack, we can jumpstart your heart. We can do open heart surgery. We can do all sorts of things like that. If you have strong mental illnesses, if you have debilitating seizures, there are, in some cases, treatments, including, I think, severing the corpus callosum is one that was used in some extreme cases. In antiquity, they do lobotomy, trepanation type stuff when they didn't have a good enough understanding. We're getting a better understanding. We certainly don't have anywhere near a full understanding of the mind. But the notion that there's a God who's put all human beings here, and this is some sort of testing ground or land of discovery where the primary purpose of life is to discover God and God's plan for you and to obey that plan so that ultimately you can go on to paradise. That notion makes no sense when there are people who suffer from strong hallucinations. And it doesn't even have to be something like schizophrenia. It can just be limitations of the senses that make things more difficult to understand, or that make the processing of evidence or the reliability of evidence difficult. What I would consider to be good evidence for a particular claim, and I think should be good evidence for anyone, there are people who don't have access to it. When we take a look at video footage of unidentified flying objects, for example, you can have a debate all day long about whether or not a particular photograph or video is sufficient to justify an observation. Whether or not our explanation of that observation is sufficient is a secondary issue. But for people who've been blind from birth, the video evidence is not going to do them any good. And so why would anybody be born blind? Why would anybody be born deaf? Why would anybody be born with any sort of processing defect that diminishes their capacity to even have reliable senses? The notion that there's a God who is ultimately wise and compassionate and has a plan for people comes in conflict with that. And religions have attempted to sort this out in a number of different fashions, not the least of which is that we don't even have to talk about adults with strong disorders. We can just look at the difference between adults and children. And so the presumption that God is good and God has a plan means that, hey, why do babies die before they're even able to, understand the concept of God? You don't have to worry about that because God's going to take care of them. God would never punish a baby, despite the fact that Christianity in most of its forms would hold that we are born as sinful beings, but God is ultimately fair. So if there's a child who dies before the age of reason or the onset of the ability to process these concepts, he'll get a straight pass to heaven. Or in the case of other things, we might have something like limbo, someplace where you go for your spiritual education because you didn't get it on earth, and then you get to make up your mind because otherwise that would be denying you the free will that is supposed to be part of this choice. Except that you don't have any evidence for that. It was a fiction invented because of gaps we found in the doctrine, in the holy book that people are referencing with regard to God within Christianity. Well, what are the other options? One of the things that I've kind of harped on in recent years is that we should and must hold people accountable for their actions, but it would be wrong to hold people accountable for things that they don't have control over. In the same way that if somebody put a gun in my hand, forced my hand up to my head, and forced my finger to squeeze the trigger, I'm not responsible for any of that. That's something that's being done to me by another person. Similarly, if there's a mental condition that is impeding, and this is where it gets difficult, what one would normally do, or typically do, normal's a loaded word, but typically do absent that influence, how do we consider that person with regard to their moral responsibility, with regard to responsibility for their action? When Charles Whitman climbed the tower at the University of Texas and killed a bunch of people with a rifle, he asked that his brain be autopsied because he didn't used to be this way and he knew something was wrong or was convinced something was wrong. And my understanding, I'm going off recollection here, is that occurred and there was a tumor. But let's set aside what actually happened. What if we found that there was a tumor? What if there was a tumor that was the proximate cause of this? If we were to find out that if we remove the tumor, someone's homicidal tendencies no longer exist, if the purpose of locking someone up in prison is to protect them and protect society and hope for some rehabilitation, if there was someone who murdered a bunch of people and then we found out that there was a tumor that was causing this uncontrollable rage and irrationality that led to this, and the tumor was removed, that person is clearly no longer a risk. And so why keep them in prison for anything other than a sort of retribution? Well, you've done this irrespective of whether or not it was, your responsibility. We're going to hold you accountable and you're going to pay some price for it. I think there are good arguments to be made along those lines, but this issue is far from simple. In the same way that you could give someone a ticket for driving while intoxicated, you can't really give someone a ticket for being an alcoholic. The condition that they have that makes them an alcoholic is separate from the actions they take, and yet they're intertwined, because I can have a drink and it's not going to be a problem. And that's not true for people I know who are alcoholics. They can never drink again for as long as they live. And if they slip off the wagon, this gets into an issue of, okay, they are responsible for the initial act, but not necessarily what happens afterwards. And I know this video isn't intended to be a discussion about moral consequences and things like that. We can certainly look into that and maybe engage in some thought experiments at a later time. But what we're talking about is a God that is going to hold people accountable for the decisions they make. It's made worse by the fact that this God created the universe, created the circumstances, created the people, decides what evidence will and won't be presented, and then specifically makes the playing field not just unfair, in which case some people might have higher intelligence and a better capacity for assessing evidence, but specifically impairs some people. And it's fine, if you're a theist who just wants to think that God's good, and so the person who's cognitively impaired by whatever condition, who could never have reasonably come to a conclusion that a God exists or what that God wanted, you're fine if you think that God's just going to take care of those people. Except that your grounds for that are your own sense of what is just and what is right. And so you're giving that attribute to God to say that God is just and right. Therefore, if I think this is what should happen under a just and right circumstance, certainly God will do that. And if God knows better than me, if there's some other just outcome, that's the one God will take. But those are all post hoc rationalizations. That's you recognizing a problem with this model and then finding a way to make it not seem like a problem. But it is a problem. If you believe in a God, and I know not everybody does, and not everybody believes in this particular type of God, but if you believe in a God that expects human beings to have a rational belief in that God and a rational, evidence-based foundation for understanding what that God wants and expects, that is in conflict with mental health issues. I had a recent relationship where I wanted to be with a person, they wanted to be with me, but they had a mental health issue that prevented that. I'm incredibly sad that until they get help or until something else changes, I won't be able to spend time with that person. But I don't blame them. And yet Christianity and some other religions are essentially arguing that God is blaming people for the obstacles that he put in their path. Ooh, God will give you the strength to overcome those obstacles. Well, prove it. Because I've seen people with mental health issues that impair their ability to even engage in daily life at a rational level. An inability to determine the actual risk of something, to where they have an unrealistic fear of a particular consequence that is incredibly unlikely. I had a friend of mine once who wouldn't go ice skating for fear that if he fell down, someone would skate over and slice off his fingers. And even after showing him that generally ice skates are a flat surface and not a razor blade, and looking up statistics on how likely this is to happen, it didn't change the fact that this was the thing that kept them from doing this. And it's not the most ridiculous fear I've ever heard of, and it's not a big deal if somebody goes ice skating. But if your place in eternity was predicated on whether or not you were able to come to a rational conclusion, and the individual who's judging you also set up the scenario so that you are almost certainly going to fail. As we pointed out in the last video, where even a optimally functioning, typical human mind, because of the nature of the universe we live in, the nature of evidence, the unreliability of the senses, the unreliability of eyewitness testimony, the problem of hard solipsism, all of these philosophical problems that conspire to make sure that we can't reach that conclusion, if they also have thrown up extra roadblocks for other people, how is that just? How's it moral? How's it benevolent? How is it different from the track coach that intentionally goes out to put obstacles in the path of people who might be able to succeed, virtually guaranteeing that they cannot? For most models of God that I've heard about, most models have been presented by theists that we are expected to accept. The existence of strong mental illnesses, of delusions, hallucinations, of irrational fears, of tumors, of things that make it virtually impossible for some people to achieve a sound foundation for certain beliefs is absolutely antithetical to the notion that that God could exist. And if that's the kind of God you believe in, then you should at least acknowledge that you believe in an unjust monster. And for my money, not only do I not believe that there's an unjust monster creating and governing the entire universe, I don't see sufficient evidence to believe that any such being exists. And it seems far more reasonable that these are primitive notions that have been spread and amplified for the benefits that they apparently provide us, while we dismiss the negative consequences of how harmful religion actually is. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.